We are living through huge food price increases. That's going to lead to food riots. That is already leading to famines in many parts of the world. And in a way, that's on us.
Much of the world has spent the last 2 years modeling how different policies will reduce COVID cases or deaths, with little or no regard to how they damage humanity. Today I sit down with a man whose job is to actually quantify these harms. Paul Frijters is a visiting professor of wellbeing economics at the London School of Economics and co-author of The Great COVID Panic: What Happened, Why, and What to Do Next.
There's kind of a madness that's crept into the population, looking for other crazy things to do. We are, as it were, in a madly stampeding herd.
This is American Thought Leaders, and I'm Jan Jekielek. Dr. Paul Frijters, such a pleasure to have you on American Thought Leaders.
It's great to see you, Jan Jekielek.
Oh, wonderful pronunciation. You're the author of The Great COVID Panic: What Happened, Why, and What to Do Next. So this isn't the typical book you'll see on the bookshelf about COVID. When did you first realize that something was going very wrong?
It would have been early March 2020. Up until then, in January and February, I sort of went along with what was happening in the media and what we were told by the medical authorities we had to do. I basically didn't give it much thought, right? I thought, well, who knows, maybe this is a terrible disease like the plague, in which case, indeed, it's going to be all hands on deck and we're going to do draconian stuff because we would anyway if there's that kind of lethality. But looking at the early data, I wasn't too worried, and neither were my students or most of my societies, of which I thought of the Netherlands and England, because my dad was Dutch and my mother was English, and I was living in London at the time. But then suddenly my students started to be very, very anxious, and the government was clearly moving towards lockdowns. And I was sort of like, what is going on here, right? And then I started to look into the data myself. And so I had been a professor of health economics for 10 years in Brisbane, and I knew how to read the models, and I knew where to look for the viral and immunology stuff. So I could read the Diamond Princess data, I could read the data that was coming out of Wuhan about how the virus was really only affecting the elderly, and even then only a small minority of them. And then I used, as it were, the skills that I'd acquired in London in the previous 5 years to do with well-being, which is that I developed a methodology to count lots of different effects in different dimensions. And I could apply that to what was coming in terms of the disruption. So I could evaluate, well, okay, how many lives are going to lose in the future because of the enormous crash in the economy that is now being mandated by the various closures. I could calculate what kind of ballpark figure the mental health crisis would look like, right? And then I laid that out against the best estimates as to what these lockdowns were supposed to do. And it was like comparing a mountain with a mole heap. And the mountain was the cost, and the mole heap was, the benefits in the best state of the world. So the costs are going to be a mountain, the benefits at best a mole heap. What the hell is going on? Something weird is going on, right? And then you start to look at crowd psychology, you start to see it in terms of a panic, you start to see it in terms of institutional overreach, the medical authorities running away with their own power lust, and you start to look differently at the modelers and what everybody else is doing. So that's sort of when I really thought, okay, something is amiss, and I sort of went into a highly analytical mode. I sort of thought, okay, I'm going to research this, right? I'm going to get on to the bottom as to what is going on and what we should do next. So already in March 2020, I started writing pieces on, well, how should we reform our institutions? I was then still stupid. I was then still believing, look, we're going to see that this was stupid in a month's time, right? I mean, I was sort of convinced that the craziness would only last a week or two, and then it would become clear to people what they were doing to their own kids, to the elderly, to the lonely, to their economies, to their jobs. And so I thought it would be a blip. But well, 2 weeks turned into 2 years. There's been many curves crashed, but it wasn't the COVID one, was it? It was more, as it were, the healthiness of our lives, the quality of our social interactions, our ability to travel, our freedoms. Lots of things got crashed, but not COVID.
And so early on, when you said you were, quote unquote, stupid, did you reach out to your peers, and professors in economy and other related disciplines? What were they saying?
Totally. So one of the first indications that something was amiss was by an Australian colleague of mine. I can name him, I think, which is Robert Gregory. He's a very smart, switched-on guy who'd was in China in January and February, I believe. And he emailed me, he said, look, this is going to be very big, right? And he too couldn't really see what the fuss was about because he'd also looked at the data and said, look, compared to the cost, this doesn't look worth all the effort, right? And then, of course, I reached out to Gigi Foster, a longtime co-author of mine, also on this particular book, but also to some of my students and to fellow professors as to, can you believe what is happening, right? And most of those I contacted were sort of like-minded, that, oh no, this is weird stuff that is going on, right? And then we formed a bit of a group, and of course there were those who were sort of fully going along with the madness. That was a nasty surprise. But we then started analysing it as a group and exchanging information and helping each other with media appearances and this and that, because it was clear that we thought we were one of the very many academic groups sort of, gearing up into anti-mode, if you like, right? But that wasn't the case. There weren't all that many. But they were there internationally. So then you find your international brothers and sisters, as it were. And there's been a huge fraternizing amongst the academic community that has seen this as a problem. And we sought each other out. And so here we are now at the Brownstone Institute, with people from 4 or 5 continents, I believe.
Well, for many people that might be watching this, right, for a long time, especially early on, for me, frankly, we were just simply unaware that this sort of discussion was being had, right? We only heard a very different side of the story. So how did you square that?
The reaction of the media was a huge surprise to me at the beginning, right? I thought there would be much more diversity. And in some places in the world, like in Australia, frankly, there were media outlets like the Australian with Michael Crichton, but also with Sky, who had their own reporter who was very much against the lockdowns, what was happening. So you did have, as it were, green shoots of reason, if you like, right? But the vast majority of the media, including in Britain, including in the US, including in much of Europe, were indeed highly complicit, were a very propagandist style, and were more than happy to go with sort of full fear. But I think it became clear to us scientists on the other side, via the Great Barrington Declaration, that in fact there were many, many more of us, and we're just keeping silent. So that declaration, by Martin Kulldorff, Bhattacharya, and Sunetra Gupta, reached close to 1 million scientists over the world, right? And interested intellectuals who signed up to what was a much more sensible approach to the pandemic, which is look after those most vulnerable, let the rest get on with their lives, right? Because life has to be lived. The mere fact that something like, well, you probably know the numbers better, 700 to 800,000 people signed up within a few weeks was a real signal, okay, we are not alone.